Thank you, everyone. Well, you've all heard the news. The world is getting hotter. And I even have a slide to show you that will show this. The world is getting warmer, about 1.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And I think there's some slides that they're going to pull up that will show this. Sea levels are rising. It's related to the accumulation of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Next slide. And I'm eager to show the next slide. It's a presentation of technological progress. Many things have been attributed to climate change. The high-intensity fires in California. Next slide. The sea level rise, the floods in Europe. And these two graphs in particular showed rising hurricanes. Both the intense hurricanes, the category 4 and 5 hurricanes, increased. This is a graph from the New York Times on the left. And rising hurricanes overall, a graph in the Financial Times. The Great Barrier Reef of Australia is in jeopardy, according to the scientists. We're in the midst of a 6th mass extinction, which is when over 90% of all species on Earth disappear. But the good news, we're told, is that solar panels have declined in cost by 90%. Wind has declined in cost by 75%. There's no need for fossil fuels. We can all go vegan to save the planet. We certainly don't need nuclear energy, as HBO reminded us. I'm here to suggest that this is not all there is to the story. There's more to the story than my slides will suggest. Can we show the next slide? No? Not so fast. Quite literally, not so fast. Next slide, please. Carbon emissions have been flat and slightly declined over the last decade. This is extraordinary news that you will not read in the Financial Times, New York Times, or Washington Post. You can see in the United Kingdom, carbon emissions peaked well over 50 years ago. Same story in France, in the United States. And in the United States in particular, we saw carbon emissions decline an astonishing 22% between 2005 and 2020. 61% of that reduction was simply due to the switch from coal to natural gas, which became abundant thanks to the fracking revolution, which was demonized by the climate change movement. You can see here, this is a story of environmental progress. According to the International Energy Agency, carbon emissions may peak this year. None of this you'll read about in the mainstream news media, which has just been delivering stories of catastrophe and apocalypse. And yet we see, in terms of fires, the total amount of the area of land in the world that has been in fire has declined 25%. And it's in fact declined more since 2019. You can see in California, we're not doomed to those high-intensity fires which destroy the crowns of the trees and turn our montane forests into shrublands. We can do prescribed burns and what President Trump inelegantly described as raking the forest floor. As usual, not wrong, just used the wrong word. When those high-intensity fires arrive in a well-managed forest, they drop to the forest floor, they burn a little hotter, but you can protect all of our mountain ecosystems through good forest management. What about floods? The reason for more area flooded is because our cities on the rivers have simply grown larger. So more area flooded, but a decline in deaths from flooding everywhere in the world, including in China and Pakistan, which have received so much publicity in recent years. Sea level rise is the climate impact that I'm the least worried about. The main reason for that is I've been to the Netherlands, 1/3 of which is below sea level, some parts of it 7 meters below sea level. The Dutch are working with the Bangladeshis to adapt these technologies. I think it's fair to say the Dutch became a rich nation while adjusting to life below sea level. One of the great explanations for why there's so much more wealth in the Northern Hemisphere in the more temperate regions than in the tropics is because they were forced to deal with adverse weather events. The idea that extreme weather events would somehow paralyze human civilization is disproven by everything that's occurred in places in the world that have seasons. Landfalling hurricanes are flat and slightly declined over the last 120 years. What then explains those New York Times and Financial Times graphs? Both are what you would technically refer to as mis- or disinformation, according to the censors that are in charge of another pet peeve of mine. On the left, they simply cherry-picked the data starting in 1980, excluding the previous 70 or 80 years. And on the right, the Financial Times editors chose to not normalize the data to account for better hurricane detection. Turns out that before there were satellites, it was very hard to tell if there was hurricanes offshore. They would look and they would just guess it. Maybe. They couldn't tell. What about deaths from natural disasters? They've declined over 90% as the global population quadrupled. In the United States, somewhere between 300 and 500 people a year die from natural disasters. Obviously, every one of those deaths is a tragedy, but on the other issue of great concern to me, drug addiction, drug overdoses, and deaths, we saw over 100,000 deaths last year. Put those two issues in context. 300 total deaths from extreme weather events in the United States. What explains the rising cost of natural disasters? It's simply that there's more wealth in harm's way. Look at Miami Beach 100 years ago, look at it today. A hurricane comes through, and sure, there's going to be more costs. When you normalize the data, which is the only way to really be able to tell what the trend of extreme weather events is over time, as Roger Pilkey has done, you can see over the last 30 years, the cost of disasters globally has declined. When you add up these two things, declining costs, declining deaths, you end up with declining overall weather and climate disasters. This has never been properly reported in any of the mainstream corporate newspapers anywhere in the world. This is one of the worst cases of climate misinformation and disinformation, and when you report the opposite on Facebook, when you report the facts, you'll be censored for it. In fact, that's what happened with Peter Ridd, the Australian expert on the Great Barrier Reef in 2021, when he recorded record corals on the Great Barrier Reef. Facebook censored Peter Ridd. Parts of the Great Barrier Reef record highest amounts of coral in 36 years. The headline isn't entirely accurate because they've only been recording coral on the Great Barrier Reef for 36 years. It could well be higher than that. Finally, in 2022, the second year in a row that they saw the coral increasing on the reef, Facebook dropped its censorship and allowed the accurate information to flow freely. What about the sixth mass extinction? Absolute lie. There is no evidence for it, and all of the evidence is against it. We've lost less than 1% of species on Earth since 1500. To be considered a mass extinction event, over 90% of your species have to be going extinct or on the verge of extinction. Just 6% are. The vast majority of species on Earth we do an excellent job of taking care of, including the magnificent sea turtles, the hawksbill sea turtle, which we over-harvested for bioplastics-based jewelry. We've brought these sea turtles back by taking extraordinary measures to save them. Around the world, the discrediting of the work of conservationists, the remarkable work of conservationists to save endangered species, has been not properly appreciated by the people preaching apocalypse and extinction. You can see that the number of areas in the world where we protect species has gone up. What about vegetarianism? It's an eating disorder I had myself for many years. Until I came home and my pregnant wife was making filet mignon and I decided maybe I wasn't a vegetarian after all. It's a noble pursuit for young people. It's not something that very many people can stick with. What about energy consumption? The picture is the same. You can go into Our World on Data or any other source and see we remain a fossil fuel powered economy. And thank goodness, because it's how we lift ourselves out of poverty, it's how we sustain this great population, and it's how we save nature. You can see Germany, all the hype of Germany, 17% of its primary energy came from renewables. It shut down its nuclear power plants, which were 3% of its primary energy, and all of it is going to be provided by fossil fuels. You can see that on the left, the declining cost of electricity from solar panels and wind turbines don't properly measure the cost of those technologies. Why? Because you're not counting all the additional transmission lines, you're not counting the additional storage, you're not counting the cost of ramping up and down your gas plants. When you actually correlate the amount of renewables penetration in an economy on the right with the cost of electricity, you see a very strong relationship. The more renewables you have, the higher the cost of your electricity. This, by the way, was a slide from Goldman Sachs that they provide their investors. Speaking of ESG, it's not something they promote to the public. What about nuclear? It remains what it always has been, the safest, cleanest way to make electricity in the world. This is, you can't even see the nuclear deaths on there because there are so few. My friend Geraldine Thomas at Imperial College London, who runs the Chernobyl Tissue Bank, is no stranger to radiation or to the worst nuclear catastrophe, and estimates that somewhere around 200 people total will die from Chernobyl, but over the 80-year period after the event. Just about 50 deaths from the accident itself. All those deaths are tragic, but to just give you a sense of it, several hundred people die every year just putting out fires. So this is a very exaggerated problem. Nuclear is the key. So what we've seen, though, is that we are potentially going to see more coal burned this year. The reason for it is that we have had incredible opposition to more oil and gas production. If you want to reduce your coal consumption, increase your gas consumption. It's that simple. If you want to increase your carbon emissions, shut down your nuclear plants and follow the example of Germany. What is climatism? It's two things. It's the dominant religion of secular elites, and it's a psychopathology. Let's take a look at both of those. Brilliantly anticipated by Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, we see one of the main trends in human life is secularization, which Jordan Peterson has so eloquently described. But you can see it here. The share of Americans that have no religious preference, that really don't believe in God, has risen steadily. During that period in time, we've seen people create a substitute religion. This from the great Pulitzer Prize-winning book from 1970, Man cannot endure his own littleness unless he can translate it into meaningfulness on the largest possible level. If we don't have a God to believe in, if we don't have a religion, we will create one, consciously or unconsciously, and that's what's occurred. As Chesterton said, the problem of disbelieving in God is not that a man ends up believing nothing. Alas, it's much worse than that. He ends up believing anything. In fact, there's a two-step process. It starts with nihilism, which is the disbelief in anything that matters, the idea that there's no meaning or purpose in the world, and then that turns into the creation of these new secular religions. Climate change is one of the big three. It's climate change, it's race, and it's gender. With climate change, you get a new external authority. We used to make ourselves right by God, now we seek to make ourselves right by nature. It's the exact same story from Judeo-Christianity translated into a new secular narrative. We lived in harmony with nature, we fell from nature when with industrial agriculture and fossil fuels. God is angry at us, that's why we're getting these additional storms. There is no redemption. All you can do is avoid the apocalypse by harmonizing with nature through renewables and organics. Yes, it is that dumb. I wish I could say there was something more sophisticated when you ripped away the curtain in Oz and you see the wizard, but it's just Greta Thunberg with a really bad religion. One that offers no sense of gratitude, no sense of redemption, no sense of real transcendence. And of course, authority meaning to go from the local level, where we best manage our resources, to the international level, where the smallest number of people have control. We've got a new set of priests, it's the scientists, and we've got a new set of witches. This is cluster B personality disorders, well studied by psychologists for a very long time. This is taken right from the DSM and the Mayo Clinic translation of it. If you're throwing soup, it's curious to me, people are throwing soup onto paintings. They're dumping milk onto the floor. They're gluing their hands to the floor. I was thinking last year, what's going on? And I was like, it reminds me of something. Right, it's my kids when they would throw temper tantrums. Except for kids, narcissism is a natural stage of development. It's okay, kids need to be narcissistic to separate their identities from their parents. Not so okay when those are grown kids or failed artists All they can do is in an episode of nihilism, try to trash something else. This is a cluster B personality disorder. It's not to say that everybody in Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion and Greenpeace is a narcissist, but it's to say that you see these behaviors emerge from groups. Similarly, we see histrionic cluster B personality disorder. It used to be called hysteria. We decided that was sexist, and so with the euphemistic treadmill, we now call it histrionic. But you know what this is: constantly seeking attention, that same sense of entitlement, dramatic, erratic, I love this part, this is right from the Mayo Clinic, speaks dramatically with strong opinions, but few facts or details to back them up, shallow, rapidly changing emotions. That's the old story, that's the old psychopathology. A new, healthy vision, a pro-human vision, is a vision of energy abundance, unlocking prosperity and environmental progress. We have to understand what we mean, in this case, by energy abundance. The first thing is just that energy has lifted so many of us out of poverty. Over 90% of humankind is now lifted out of poverty. You can see that the amount of land that we need to produce the same amount of food has declined dramatically, over 60% since 1960. This is the main event for saving endangered species. If you want to save mountain gorillas or blue-nosed penguins or any of the major species that are at risk of extinction, you just need to reduce the amount of land that we use for farming and ranching, produce more food on less land, and you have more room for endangered species. This is what has been occurring for meat production. Humans use about half of the ice-free surface of the Earth. Of that half of it is for meat production alone. So there are impacts to our meat consumption. The good news is you can just put more cows or pigs or chicken on the same amount of land. And it turns out it's better for the economy to do that. It's also better for the natural environment. This is why you see grasslands and forests returning in France and Spain. In the northeast of the United States, the Maine woods, New Hampshire, Martha's Vineyard, made possible by the incredible productivity unlocked by modern industrial agriculture in the Midwest and in more productive regions of the world. What about climate change? This is a slightly complicated slide, but it's the only slide you need to debunk the idea that temperatures would somehow outweigh more fertilizers, more tractors, better seeds, better chemical inputs, and better irrigation. You can see the black dots are what you would expect to get if farmers continue to behave as farmers, which is to say, increasing productivity. If farmers stop being farmers and simply wait for the world to get warmer, the little white dots are what you would see in terms of declining productivity. But the good news is we can't stop farmers from being farmers. What about the Netherlands? Everyone points to the Netherlands. You may have seen the farmer protests. The farmers had good reason to protest. They had been working with the government to reduce nitrogen pollution for the last 40 years. A very healthy exchange, reducing the solid manures so that they didn't get the runoff and you were able to control the nitrogen. It was working well. The government and the EU got overly aggressive. The Dutch were right to protest, and bravo to the Dutch who are here. I'm big admirers of that protest. They won the hearts and minds of the fellow people in the Netherlands. There is no rich, low-energy country, just as there is no poor, high-energy one. The Germans can reduce their per capita energy consumption a little bit over time, but they certainly don't go to Vietnamese, Indonesian, or Indian levels. It took us about 20 years to debunk the mythology that you could have all of this wealth and prosperity without having a high-energy economy. Happily, that moment is gone. This is now recognized as the reality. The older environmental picture, which was that we needed to reduce everything, reduce energy, reduce material throughput, was half wrong and half right. If you want to save nature, you need to not use it or use less of it. If you're going to do that, you need to have substitutes, and you need to intensify your energy consumption. We save nature by using more energy so that we can produce more food on less land and return our farmed areas to grasslands and forests. A high-energy society is a society of abundance and a society of environmental progress. That relationship is absolutely seen everywhere around the world. Massive declines of conventional pollutants we've seen over the last several decades in every rich country in the world. We see, we'll probably get to this a little bit in the talk. I know I've got to wrap it up a bit, but you can see renewables are not able to provide. I'll just show one graph from my home state of California. We look at California a lot, and you can see renewables are not able to provide the reliable generation that we need. So in 2011, we actually generated more electricity than we did in 2021 after a very intense period of solar panel installation. And the reason was twofold. We shut down our second to last nuclear plant, and we had drought years and had less hydroelectricity. So there's inherent limits to what we can get from these renewables. This was all brilliantly predicted by a German economist about 10 years ago. When wind becomes 30% of your electricity, its economic value declines 40%. When solar becomes 15%, its value declines 50%. That's simply because the sun is not always shining, the wind is not always blowing, and there's nothing you can do to change those things. These are inherent physical limits to renewables. Why did solar panels become so cheap? Well, it helped that they were made by people living in concentration camps. Whatever you think of solar panels, I don't think as a society we should stand by and continue to import products that are made by persecuted religious minorities housed in concentration camps abroad. That's got to end. If you want to get 4 hours of electrical backup of our grid in the United States, you're going to need to spend about $750 billion. That's why not even the biggest advocates of renewables think that batteries are the way to go. They're great for your smartphones and your laptops. So when you think about saving the environment, I want you to think about your smartphone. This bit of academic jargon, dematerialization, this is the process of saving nature. Reducing mining, reducing material throughput, reducing waste, all of that made possible through substitution. Imagine your old stereo console systems. You guys, anyone that's old enough to remember the old stereo console systems? Now you have a little Bluetooth speaker like that big, you know, and your stereo console systems, when you threw them away, everyone would put them on the curb. You know, you put the sign free on it. Everybody in the neighborhood would rain on it a few times until you realized that no one else wanted it. That's the process of dematerialization. Whole forests were destroyed from my newspaper reading habit just a couple decades ago. So this is the way to think about saving nature. High energy society, reducing material throughput, and you can see it in the energy transitions themselves. We're going from carbon intensive, materials intensive, land intensive fuels to hydrogen intensive fuels. You go from wood to coal with about 1 carbon atom and 1 hydrogen atom. You go from coal to natural gas, 4 hydrogen atoms, 1 coal atom, till you get to nuclear. When you interview women in the third world, as many of you probably have, you talk to them about what it's like to cook with wood and dung. One of the things they tell you is that it's liberation to be able to just turn on a little bit of LPG. You know, it's not just that it removes all the smoke from the house, they can go and do other things than having to blow on the fire. There's nothing that's been more liberatory for women and girls than fossil fuels. I'll wrap up by saying I don't think we should end there. I think we have to get over our fears of nuclear. We have to recognize it as the ecological technology that it is. It takes 300 to 400 times more land to produce the same amount of electricity from solar and wind as it does from nuclear. And that's the same all around the world. You go into Google Maps and draw a line around power plants divided by the amount of electricity it creates. That's a power density measure. Any high school student can do it and see for themselves how energy dense natural gas and nuclear are. This is all of the nuclear waste produced by the Swiss nuclear program. Just put it on a basketball court somewhere, a couple security guards, it's fine, nothing can happen to it. It's never the plot of a James Bond movie. It's perfectly safe in there. And by contrast, this is just the wind turbine blades from a small number of wind turbines. There is no way to recycle these. They just are buried underground and we pretend that they're ecological. They do not compost. So what is the new story? Philippa asked me to contribute a sense of what is the new story. Love humanity. That is something that our opponents in the Malthusian anti-human left are unable to do. Love humanity, love all of humanity. Gas for the world. There's no need for wood or dung or coal or any solid fuels. Go nuclear. We've built a pro-nuclear movement over the last several years. We've saved our last nuclear plant in California. There's no nuclear better than the nuclear that we have. We need to save and build more of them. And you can see it's having an impact. Republicans were fine with nuclear. It's the Democrats who changed their mind. If you want to build a majority coalition, it's got to be with gas and nuclear. We don't need wood and coal. We can leave those technologies behind, and we can build a governing majority across the Western world. Thank you guys very much. Thank you.